Right, so it's not every day that the BBC, the self-styled bastion of British impartiality as it supposedly is, finds itself accused of censorship and racism by the very journalists it employs. But when over 100 of its own staff take the unprecedented step of calling out the broadcaster for acting like Israel's unofficial PR department, it's clear something has gone terribly wrong. Once praised for telling the truth to power, the BBC now stands accused of suppressing it, silencing Palestinian voices, burying war crimes, and hiding behind the hollow shield of balance whilst Gaza burns. Instead of reporting the news, the BBC has now become it, entangled in scandal, censorship, and a deepening crisis of credibility. And at the centre of it all sits Sir Robbie Gibb, a board member whose fingerprints critics allege are all over the broadcaster's lurch towards political obedience. This is not just editorial misjudgment, it is, according to its own staff, institutional betrayal. Right, so the BBC, for it is them in bother again, supposedly the gold standard of British impartial journalism, well, perhaps once upon a time, it's a view that has increasingly become a sick joke for more and more people, though, and has now been rocked by rebellion from within, as even the staff at the BBC join in with that more general consensus that the BBC is a busted flush when it comes to Israel. Over 100 BBC journalists and staff members have joined more than 300 media professionals in signing an open letter accusing the corporation of anti-Palestinian racism and institutionalised censorship. Aside from the BBC staff, other signatories include the likes of Charles Dance, Miriam Margolyes, Mike Lee and William Dalrymple. They demand that the BBC confront the ideological rot within its leadership and remove Robbie Gibb, seen as being central to the issue, the former Conservative spin doctor as he is, and before that he was, of course, BBC head of news, so this is not a new problem at all, is it? And current BBC board member, as he has subsequently become, for his alleged conflict of interest and editorial interference. This letter has arose from a growing internal recognition that the BBC's coverage of Israel's actions in Gaza, particularly the genocide being inflicted upon the Palestinian population, has veered dangerously away from truth and public service. The centre of this controversy is the BBC's decision to shelve a completed documentary titled Gaza Doctors Under Attack, which was meant to shed light on Israeli attacks against medical professionals during the ongoing onslaught. The BBC, in an act of seemingly blatant cowardice, shelved it, only for the production company who actually made it to take the documentary elsewhere, to Channel 4, who aired it last night, because they had no problems with it. So why did the BBC then? For many within the BBC, this decision was the last straw. Clearest sign yet that their employer has morphed into a PR wing for Israeli state narratives. The open letter addressed to Director General Tim Davie and the BBC board is unequivocal in tone. It speaks of fear within the BBC when it comes to reporting accurately and critically on Israel's conduct. The letter alleges a pattern of institutional censorship where stories that might portray Israel in a negative light are either watered down or killed off outright. At its most damning, it suggests that the suffering of Palestinians is treated as less significant, less newsworthy, and less human. The most explosive charge relates to the Gaza Doctors Under Attack documentary. Though the documentary had passed through all the BBC's editorial checks and was ready for broadcast, it was shelved with no explanation that satisfies either the staff or public interest. Staff say the decision to block its broadcast came from high up, possibly even from board-level interference, and that it represents a deliberate effort to suppress the full horror of Israel's war crimes in Gaza. The letter doesn't merely point out institutional cowardice, it uses the language of structural racism. It denounces the BBC's editorial double standards, referring to the different ways Palestinian and Israeli lives are valued in its coverage. It criticises the euphemistic language used to describe Israeli military actions, terms like conflict and retaliation instead of genocide or ethnic cleansing. It notes how Palestinians are often reduced to faceless statistics, while Israeli or Ukrainian victims of violence are humanised with names and stories and sympathetic interviews. A study by the Muslim Council of Britain's Centre for Media Monitoring, the CFMM, analysed over 35,000 BBC news items and found that Israeli deaths received 33 times more coverage than Palestinian ones. It further noted that Palestinians are frequently depicted through a security lens, as threats, not victims, and that words like terrorist are disproportionately used to describe them. At the centre of the staff's revolt is Robbie Gibb. Appointed to the BBC board under Boris Johnson's Conservative government, Gibb serves on the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee, giving him substantial influence over what content makes it to air. His critics argue that his previous roles make him utterly unfit to act as a neutral party in the pursuit of public interest journalism. Gibb was Director of Communications for Theresa May and sat on the editorial board of the Jewish Chronicle, a particularly rancid publication with a long history of right-wing pro-Israel content and several libel cases involving false claims about pro-Palestinian campaigners to its name. In fact, the paper nearly went under until a group of like-minded individuals, including Gibb, stepped in to save it. Staff allege that Gibb's ideological and political biases are incompatible with the BBC's charter-mandated obligation to impartiality. What makes matters worse is that Gibb has allegedly not recused himself from decisions that directly involve coverage of Israel. This, in the eyes of the letter's signatories, constitutes a serious conflict of interest. The letter argues his position is untenable, and his continued influence threatens to erode public trust in the BBC's ability to cover international affairs impartially. Faced with all these allegations, the BBC has done what it always seems to do, though, and offered little more than corporate platitudes. That it is fully committed to covering the Gaza conflict impartially and has produced powerful coverage from the region. However, it has not addressed the most pressing concerns, the accusations of racism, the suppression of journalism, or the influence of Gibb's editorial role. Such evasiveness has only fueled the perception that the BBC is in denial or outright complicity. Former and current staff have described an internal culture where fear of being labelled anti-Semitic or politically biased has ended up stifling legitimate reporting.